I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and we're gonna do some shoebox dyeing today. I am so excited, and I'm gonna do something I don't think I've done before with these shoeboxes. I may have done it before in another circumstance, but I'm very excited about this idea, and I hope you're gonna love it too. But first, I want to give a huge shout out and thank you to today's lab partner, Emery. Emery, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. Now, normally when I use a plastic shoebox to dye yarn, and I call this my shoebox technique, I'll add the yarn in the shoebox with some water but no acid. I'll pour on some dyes, let it sit for a little while, again with no acid in there. And then immediately before moving the yarn, I'll add some acid and then move the yarn to blend the colors, but you end up with some of the original dyes showing through, some colors spread all over. The effects are a bit random and beautiful and blended, and I love it. But what would we get if we add the dye to the water before we add the yarn? Now, a lot of those colors would blend before adding the yarn, but if I do things quickly enough, they might not blend completely. So I don't know if we'll get something there that's gonna feel similar to the result we're gonna have in the other container or not. And so this is what we're gonna try to do today. But I'll talk more about it along the way. Let's go take a look at our colors. For this project, I picked two bright colors that I know spread a lot. We have Caribbean Blue and Sour Apple. And then we have two colors that are deeper and maybe a little bit more pigmented. We have Blued Steel and Deep Purple. These are all Dharma acid dyes. And I haven't decided if we're eventually gonna lift and move the yarn before adding acid or right after adding acid. There are some variables that I'm still considering, but let's go ahead and mix up these colors. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves to start mixing up the dyes. In each shoebox, we're gonna have 200 grams of yarn. And a starting point I like to have in my head sometimes when I want to go for something on the more saturated side is to use 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. But I know that some of these colors can be very intense, so we're gonna go for a total amount of dye of 1 gram of dye per shoebox. Therefore, I measured out approximately 1/4 gram, 0.25 grams of each color twice. And I know that there might be some small measuring inconsistencies here when I'm measuring out a volume so small, but I don't want a ton of leftovers of these colors today. I feel like we're gonna see a lot of differences from adding the dyes into the water before the yarn or after the yarn, that some slight differences in measuring isn't going to be a huge deal. And if we think it was, then, well, we can always repeat this experiment another day. I dissolved all the dyes in hot tap water, not measuring the volume, but attempting to eyeball things to keep it as similar as possible. Again, I know that I should be controlling the volume a little bit more to be more scientifically accurate, but this is a very qualitative project anyway. The yarn we're gonna dye today is Knit Picks Stroll Fingering Weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino wool, 25% nylon. And if you wanna learn more about the yarn or any other tools and equipment I'm using in my video, I will have links and affiliate links down in the video description. And I may earn a commission if you make a purchase through one of my affiliate links. And I'm gonna pre-soak that yarn for at least 30 minutes in some tap water with no acid because we want to add the acid after the yarn and dye are in contact with one another. My tap water is slightly acidic, so I do see some dyes start to bind to the yarn before I've added acid, which is one of the reasons why this technique works. So if you're not getting results similar to mine using the same brands of dye and yarn bases, it could be the pH of your water, and it's worth checking that. A couple of the colors I went closer to 0.3 grams, but I tried to be consistent as possible within the two colors. And it's worth noting again, Caribbean Blue is a pain to dissolve. I always forget that this color really benefits from boiling water. It likes to clump on the spoons, so I'm just gonna have a lot of stirring, probably need more water in those two. But I'm gonna finish this up and then we will be ready to set up our dye baths. I'm excited. All right. We have our 2 shoe boxes, each with 8 cups of water and no acid. I'm gonna add 200 grams of yarn to this one. And this is the way I plan to add the yarn into this container. So it's gonna be after we have the dye. And I was thinking, I'm getting the yarn ready to go off camera. And I was thinking that I'm not gonna wiggle it a ton when I add it. I'm gonna add it in, try to do exactly what I did here, and then let it sit for 30 minutes and then lift and move it around just like I plan to do over here. So breathe, Rebecca, breathe. Okay, let's go ahead and start with our sour apple dye. I know things are gonna move and blend a lot more in here. I'm gonna try to go quickly. Our Caribbean blue. Our Caribbean blue, that is a color that has a lot of pigmentation. I know I'm swapping. This is, I think, the blued steel. I ain't even, or that could be the purple. I may lose a little track. The purple looks a little bit brown at first. I think that was the purple. This was the blued steel. Okay. But working quickly, adding our yarn in, scrunched up. All right, things are way, way more blended here, but I'm gonna try to not touch this anymore. There is some beautiful variation in there. Oh my goodness, like this is stunning and gorgeous. There may still be some white sections in the yarn, but we will move everything eventually. I'm gonna set a timer for 30 minutes, and at that point we'll add acid, lift the yarn, and move it around. But looking at these 2 containers right here, what I'm expecting to see is more blending on here eventually, but we're still gonna have elements that are gonna be a lot more blue and green. It's gonna feel more variegated. This is gonna feel a lot more tonal and smooth and subtle. Now, the reason why things end up working out differently is that here we had something to provide resist in allowing those colors to blend. And that resist is the yarn itself. When we pour the dye onto the yarn, yes, some of it is gonna move through and diffuse around, but a lot of it is sort of more stuck in place. There's not as much ability for the momentum of pouring the dye in to push the dye all the way through like we had over here, where, oh man, I probably could have done this a little bit faster, like 1, 2, 3, 4, and then added it, but I wanted to try to be similar. And I do see some differences in here. I see more almost pink tones, more green. I see a lot of pigment down there. And in this one, looking at the sides, I see a lot of white still. Let me go ahead and clean up these little cups. I'll be adding that leftover dye into a leftover dye container I've been collecting so far this year. And then I'll show what the sides look like. 4 minutes since I started the timer. Here's a side view of our yarn first pan. An end view of both. You can see that we do have some white over here, but it's also very dark where that color has sort of ended up. And here's the side view of our dye first container. The color is a lot more distributed. I am so curious how this will feel in the end. And I think that it could be hard to replicate this overall effect of adding the dye into the water first and then adding the yarn to move things around. Now, this is bringing to mind another experiment that we could do, and that would be adding the dye to the yarn, moving it right away without adding acid to it. One reason why I like to add acid before I move it is that I like those colors to stay in place a little bit as much as I like them to move around when we lift and blend. So, I don't know. What I do know is that with Stroll, colors strike super fast, even with no acid. And so this is just something to play around with more. There's a lot of variations. I am obsessed with this yarn. I just don't know how reproducible it'll be. So maybe the next step is to do something like I set up here today, pour all the colors in, add the yarn, and maybe do 1, 2, add the yarn to everything all at once and see. But there's so many slight variations that we can do to the technique. And the thing about that that makes it fun is that you learn more about what the colors do and how you want to proceed. But I do need to say, I figure if I'm going to talk a lot, I may as well hop in front of the camera. I do need to add that some of what's happening here is pigment dependent. 2 of the colors I picked, the Sour Apple and the Caribbean Blue, are colors that take longer to bind to the yarn. And therefore, they're gonna spread more, especially cold with no acid, than other colors. If you pick all colors that strike really quickly, like maybe Pink Orchid or Royal Purple, then you might not be able to see the spread that we saw in our container where we added the colors to the water first and then the yarn. Because I've had stirred dye baths, added our yarn into there cold, and had things strike pretty unevenly and really, really quickly. So keeping an eye on the pigments that you're using and playing with them a lot and getting that feel for them can affect the results that you see. So it's not always just technique. Sometimes the individual dyes make a difference. And now we have about 20 minutes left on the timer, and I'm gonna try not to move the camera until the timer goes off. And here we are after the timer's gone off. All right, we're gonna do the less dramatic one first. I'm assuming it's gonna be less dramatic. 3 tablespoons of white vinegar. Then I'm immediately gonna lift. And there was still some gradient of dye. You know, I do see a lot of super tonal patches in here. But otherwise, the coverage all over the yarn seems to be pretty good. But it's fun to see that there's definitely deeper patches and lighter patches in there, that it's not super even. But also don't forget, when I added it in, I did not move it very much at first. If we wanted more even coverage, we should have stirred the dye and everything. Okay, we're gonna do 1, 2, 3, lift. Ooh, see lots of fun colors, and then put it back down. Try not to get dye all over my hands. Give it a good wiggle in here. And so now we have successfully covered up most of the white areas on our yarn, but you can see a huge difference between the two. Actually on camera, I don't know if you can tell the huge difference. I see a huge difference. This is mostly teal overall. You can see that deep purple really marked it in areas. And I think that these differences will be more obvious once the yarn is dry. But it actually is kind of fun that things, I mean, I'm looking at the tiny like 2-inch monitor on the camera. Things are looking pretty similar right here. And there's something really fun about that because it's not that similar at this stage. But also just like the average color, and like it does make a difference what you add first or second, but yeah, it's just, I don't know. I'm happy. Now, of course, the biggest question is gonna be which one do I eventually send to Emery? Because I like both. And so I've now put lids on these, and I'm gonna set them aside It is like noon on a Thursday. I'm gonna set them aside for 24 hours, maybe longer. It's a long weekend, so it could be more than 2 days. It could be more like 4 or 5 days. And then we'll come back and steam set the yarn for this cold process. Let's take a moment to talk about cold process dyeing. This is a technique that I could do in like a dye pot, a dye kettle. But there are some reasons why I'm not doing that. I have 2 dye pots, like you might make pasta or something in, although all my tools and equipment are dedicated for dyeing yarn and are never used for the preparation of food. But they're different sizes. And because they have a different circumference, that could alter some of the results from comparing like the 2 containers to each other. Plus, because they're taller, it's harder to see what's going on, especially if my hands are in the way, and I really like the shape of the shoe boxes. But that doesn't really talk about cold process dyeing at all. Because I have limited containers, vessels, where I can heat the yarn on the stove, it can be faster and more efficient for me to set up yarn, let it sit for a couple of days in the dye bath to slowly absorb the color, and then spend a day steam setting all the yarn while I'm editing or doing something else. This allows me to dye a lot more yarn in a given period of time and works well for me. Now, if you've left the yarn outside and it's really hot, do you need that steam setting step? I like to do it just in case. Some pigments you may not need to get exposure to steam at that hot temperature, but there are other pigments that may need it, and so I feel more confident in that my colors are well set with that 30-minute steam. And you'll see that sometimes after adding acid, a lot of the color gets sucked into the yarn really quickly. There's no reason why you have to wait days. It's just scheduling wise, that's usually what ends up working out well for me, and so that's the reason why I do it. It is the next day. Let's see. Okay, I have them in the opposite order, but thankfully I can tell this had dye then yarn, this had yarn then dye. But I'm gonna go ahead and steam set all of this yarn all together. There's a little bit of blue dye left, but ooh, we do have variation in here that I'm excited about. I see like a hint of more purple there. Ooh, there's definitely, I don't know if we can call it breaking because we didn't have a uniform mixture to start with. Color breaking is when you have a mixture of pigments and they separate into the different colors. And so you might have a green mixture but see patches that are more yellow, patches more blue, or a purple with more blue and more red. And so that implies a uniform mixture, which we did not have. Now what's interesting is that the color left over in each of these feels a bit different. For example, I'm seeing some like globs of red in this one that I'm not really seeing over here, and so that's interesting. Now, I am putting everything in the pot together. I don't know if there's a potential for color transfer from one area of the yarn to another. That could happen, but I'm still gonna put it in and we're gonna hope for the best. So I'm gonna steam set the yarn for 30 minutes and I'll wash out these containers to reuse. I just think it's interesting that when we added the yarn before the dye that we have a little bit more pigment left than when we had the dye in first then the yarn. But, you never know how things will happen. But anyway, I'll see you in about 30 minutes when we're done heat setting the yarn. It has been 30 minutes. I'm gonna turn off the heat. We are very steamy and my white balance is off. But let's remove our yarn. Okay, and I see no evidence of color transfer from one set to the other. I'm thrilled with the amount of variation that we have in the color in the dye first. Which goes to show how, ooh, that's hot. There's a lot of water in these. which goes to show why if you're going to do kettle dyeing, mixing up the dye can be really important before you add the yarn in. But I'm gonna go and set the yarn aside to cool completely to room temperature so we can wash it. Okay, we're gonna wash the more variegated one on camera. I'm adding some blue dish soap in first so you can see the slight color. It changed it. And the reason why I'm doing this one is because there were more particles in that box. And so I figured that this is the one to wash on camera and we're not seeing any bleeding. I always wash the fiber to help just make sure that there isn't any unbound dye, because you want to know also if a yarn is going to be a bleeder before you use it in color work or anything like that. And yeah, we're good. No color on my hands. All the color is staying in the yarn. So I'm gonna go put this through my spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and I'm gonna wash the other yarn off camera, but I'll pop back in if I observe anything different from what we just saw. Sometimes I get nervous that a demonstration is not gonna work out. Like I have an idea in my head of what should happen, even if I don't know exactly what will happen, but I have an idea in my head. And it's really great to have things turn out the way that I thought. Because when you have yarn in your dye bath and then add dye on top of it, the yarn being in the dye bath prevents the dye from spreading all the way. And that's how we ended up with this variegated yarn. Now eventually we did move everything around and blend what was left, but we can see elements of a lot of those original colors in this yarn. Now what I love is that we got beautiful, very soft and subtle, but beautiful variation in the yarn where we added our dye to the dye bath first and then the yarn. And what this here shows is that it's really important to stir things well if you want even color. Furthermore, you want to have a large volume of water as even coverage as possible on your yarn, because we started cold with no acid here. And so this is the best case scenario for getting our dyes to spread all over the yarn. Now the one thing I didn't do was stir the yarn a lot to move things around, but I do find that with just tap water, and my tap water is slightly acidic, but with my tap water I will see colors start to strike to the yarn right away, which is something that we also see right here because we added acid immediately before lifting the yarn out of the container. But I think even without adding acid, we still would have seen some patches of green and blue and not everything completely blended like we have over here. Now the final thing that's kind of fun is that we have differences here. And yeah, this one has more blue in one section more than the other. And again, that's because the dyes were able to spread around a bit, but there may have been localized areas that had more blue or a little bit less of the green, giving us more differences between those two skeins. And oddly enough, we have more consistency with what we have over here. And that's just pretty fun. Emery, thank you so much for being my lab partner for today's episode of Dyepot Weekly. I really hope that you've enjoyed this video and that you're gonna love your yarn. I'm planning on sending you the more variegated one because it's so unique and special. But it was a hard choice because I also really, really love how that one turned out. And I think I'm gonna need to do that more. Editing Rebecca, maybe Hanukkah, because then we can test how consistent we can be. But anyway, Emery, thank you again for being my lab partner. And if you love the yarn I dye and want to bring some home, or you want to consider being a lab partner, go and check out the listings in the ChemKnits Creations Etsy shop. I'll have it linked down below. And also in the video description, you can find, well, there's a lot of links, but you can find where you can locate me on social media. And I have affiliate links to the tools and equipment that I use in my videos, and so I may earn a commission if you make a purchase through one of those links. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I love to dye yarn and to explore the way that different variables or I suppose, orders of operation. This is more of an orders of operation kind of project, but how that can make a difference in the way the colors come out. And yes, I do have a scientific background. I have a PhD in biochemistry and molecular pharmacology, and I did start ChemKnits while I was in grad school and really created it to be my lab notebook to keep track of my projects, so that way if I wanted to knit something again or then dye something again, maybe I could try to reproduce it. And well, here we are hundreds, thousands of videos later, playing with color, and I really hope you enjoyed the journey, so please subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. But anyway, digression. There are some variables and things that make a huge impact in how the color comes out, and there's others that can be a lot more subtle. And then there's also the pigments themselves. You could pick dye colors that some slight differences of when you add the acid and heat can make a huge difference or a minimal difference. And so it's always fun to explore. And I find that you can always be really excited with the end result if you approach your dyeing project as, I wonder what will happen if. And I'm like, and thinking, ooh, what will we get if we combine these colors in a shoebox and do this technique? How will that end up? The times where I get more anxious and nervous are when I have a specific end result in my head and I'm trying to get there and maybe things don't behave the way I think. And so, yeah, I think that if you're ever curious about how I'm able to do this and be excited with the results, I try to go in with a, ooh, how will this turn out? Because then you can always be excited with what you're gonna see. And on that note, I'm about to go dye up some more yarn. And so I'm really excited to show off some more pretty colors. Thank you so much for watching.